Attention on deck. The kind of words you only hear when everything has changed, when the game has already begun and there's no going back. Those three words echoed through the gilded ballroom like a thunderclap, cutting through the laughter that had followed my father's cruel joke, silencing the hundreds of wedding guests who had just moments before been enjoying his performance at my expense. The champagne flute in his hand trembled slightly, the golden liquid catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above as his face drained of color, transforming from the ruddy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable to the pale shock of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. It started 6 months earlier when the ivory envelope arrived at my base in Germany, addressed to simply Eva Rostova, with no acknowledgement of my rank. No recognition of the decade I'd spent earning the title of captain in the United States Army Intelligence Corps. The deliberate omission was so perfectly my father that I almost laughed, standing there in my office surrounded by classified documents and strategic assessments that influenced national security decisions, holding a wedding invitation that reduced me to nothing more than a wayward daughter who needed to come home and play her assigned role in the family theater. My name is Captain Eva Rostova, 32 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years of my life serving my country in ways most people will never know about, can never know about, because the work I do exists in shadows and silence, in encrypted communications and redacted reports. I specialize in Eastern European intelligence operations, a bitter irony considering my father fled the Soviet Union in the 80s with grand dreams of American success, only to recreate the same authoritarian household he claimed to have escaped. Standing in that office, 3,000 miles from home, I held my sister Katya's wedding invitation and felt the familiar weight of family obligation pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The same suffocating pressure I'd felt every day of my childhood until I'd finally found the strength to break free. The military had saved me, though my father would never understand that, would never accept that the discipline and structure I found in service was nothing like the control and manipulation he wielded at home. Where he demanded blind obedience, the Army taught me strategic thinking. Where he valued appearance above all else, my commanding officers valued competence and courage. Where he saw my gender as a limitation to be overcome through marriage to the right man, the military saw it as just another aspect of who I was. Neither advantage nor disadvantage, just another factor in the complex equation of service and sacrifice. Before I tell you what happened, next, I need you to understand something about families like mine, about fathers like mine, about the particular brand of immigrant ambition that can twist love into control and turn success into a weapon against your own children. Stories like this don't get told in mainstream media because they don't fit the narrative of the American dream that everyone wants to believe in, the one where hard work and determination always lead to happiness and fulfillment. But here, in this story, I'm going to tell you the truth about what happens when that dream becomes a nightmare, when success becomes a prison, and when the only way to break free is to use every skill, every connection, every hard-earned advantage you fought for against the very people who should have been fighting for you. Let me take you back to where this really started, to a cramped apartment in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, where the smell of borscht and cigarette smoke clung to everything like a second skin, where Russian voices echoed through thin walls and my mother's tears fell silently into the sink as she washed dishes late into the night. I was 8 years old the first time I understood that my father's love came with conditions, with expectations that shifted like sand, but always seemed designed to keep us off balance, always reaching for approval that would never quite come. The kitchen of that apartment was small, barely large enough for our family of 5 to sit around the scarred wooden table my parents had bought from a thrift store. But it was there that the battles for our souls were fought, meal after meal, year after year. My mother, Elena, was a ghost of the woman she must have been before marriage, before immigration, before the weight of my father's ambitions crushed her spirit into something small and manageable. She moved through our home like she was afraid of taking up too much space, of making too much noise, of existing too boldly in the presence of Dmitry Rostova, who filled every room he entered with his voice, his opinions, his unshakable certainty that he knew best about everything, especially about what his daughter should become. She had been a pianist in Moscow, trained at the conservatory, but her hands hadn't touched piano keys since we'd arrived in America. Too busy working double shifts as a seamstress to help pay for the lifestyle my father insisted we maintain. The appearance of success that mattered more to him than our actual happiness or well-being. My father was a force of nature wrapped in a three-piece suit. A man who had reinvented himself from a minor Soviet bureaucrat into an American real estate developer through sheer will and a ruthlessness that he wore like cologne. He spoke English with a thick accent he refused to soften, claiming it gave him character, made him memorable in business dealings. But I think he kept it as a reminder of where he came from. A badge of honor that said he had conquered this new world without surrendering his old one. Every morning, he would stand before the mirror in our hallway, adjusting his tie with military precision, and recite his daily affirmation. Rostova men are winners. Rostova women are prizes. Even at 8, I knew I didn't want to be anyone's prize. The moment that changed everything came on a humid September afternoon when I was 12, sitting at that same kitchen table doing homework while my mother prepared dinner and my father held court about his latest business triumph. My younger sister Katya, only 7 then, sat coloring quietly, already learning the art of invisibility that would serve her well in our household. My older brother Mikhail, 15 and already being groomed as my father's heir apparent, lounged in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who knew his place in the world was secure. The television in the living room was playing news coverage of military operations in Afghanistan, the volume low but still audible. And I found myself drawn to the measured voices of the reporters, the sense of purpose in the soldiers' movements, the idea that somewhere in the world, people were fighting for something bigger than themselves. "Papa," I said, not realizing I was about to light a fuse that would burn for the next 20 years. "I want to join the military when I grow up." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes either laughter or violence, and in our house, you never knew which way it would go. My mother's hand stilled over the pot she was stirring, the wooden spoon suspended in mid-air like she was frozen in time. Mikhail snorted, already preparing his mockery. But my father's reaction was what mattered, what always mattered, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft in that dangerous way that meant someone was about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. "The military," he repeated, tasting the words like they were something rotten, something that needed to be spit out immediately. "My daughter thinks she wants to play soldier. Tell me, Eva, what do you know about the military? What do you know about service and sacrifice and honor?" The words were weapons, each one carefully chosen to cut, to diminish, to remind me of my place in his carefully ordered world. But something inside me, some stubborn kernel of defiance that would later serve me well in basic training in combat zones and intelligence briefings, refused to back down. "I know they serve something bigger than money," I said, meeting his eyes even though every instinct told me to look away, to submit, to apologize for having dreams that didn't align with his vision for my life. "I know they protect people who can't protect themselves. I know they earn respect through action, not just words." The slap came fast, not hard enough to really hurt, but sharp enough to shock, to remind me that in this house, in his house, respect was not earned but demanded. And questioning his values was the ultimate betrayal. But that moment, that sting on my cheek, and the tears I refused to let fall, that was when I knew I would join the military, not in spite of his opposition, but because of it. It would take 6 more years of careful planning, of excellent grades and secret meetings with recruiters, of forging his signature on permission forms and lying about weekend activities. But I would do it. I would escape the gilded cage he was building around us, bar by bar, expectation by expectation. And I would prove that Rostova women could be more than prizes, more than decorations, more than silent witnesses to their own lives. The years between 12 and 18 were a masterclass in survival, in maintaining the appearance of compliance while building my escape route one small rebellion at a time. I excelled in school, which pleased my father because it would look good on college applications to the Ivy League schools, where he expected me to find a suitable husband. I joined the track team, which he tolerated because it kept me fit and attractive. I studied languages, Russian and German and Arabic, which he approved of because they would make me more interesting at dinner parties. But every achievement, every skill I developed was actually another tool in my arsenal. Another qualification that would make me valuable to the military he despised. My mother knew, I think, what I was planning. Sometimes I would catch her watching me with something that might have been pride or might have been fear, probably both. The complicated emotions of a woman who wanted more for her daughter than she had managed for herself, but who also knew the cost of defying Dmitry Rostova. She never said anything directly, but sometimes she would leave college brochures for schools with ROTC programs on my bed. Or she would mention casually that Mrs. Volkov's daughter had joined the Air Force and was doing well. Or she would hug me a little tighter, a little longer, like she was trying to give me strength through osmosis. The day I left for basic training was the last day my father spoke to me for 3 years. I had waited until I was 18, until he had no legal power to stop me, and I had enlisted without telling anyone except my mother, who drove me to the bus station at 4 in the morning while the rest of the family slept. "Be strong, my Eva," she whispered in Russian as she held me one last time, and I could feel her trembling, whether from fear or cold or something else entirely. "Be everything he said you couldn't be." Those words carried me through the hardest days of basic training, through the moments when my body wanted to quit, when the drill sergeant screamed in my face, when I wondered if maybe my father had been right about my limitations. But he hadn't been right, had never been right about me or about what women could do when given the chance to prove themselves. I excelled in basic training, not because I was naturally athletic or particularly tough, but because I had been training my whole life for this, learning to endure discomfort, to follow orders while maintaining my own sense of self, to find strength in service rather than domination. The drill sergeants who tried to break me down didn't know they were dealing with someone who had been broken down and rebuilt herself so many times that the process had become almost comfortable, almost familiar. After basic training came advanced individual training, where I discovered my aptitude for intelligence work, for seeing patterns others missed, for understanding the motivations and vulnerabilities that drove people to make the choices they did. Perhaps it was all those years of navigating my father's moods, of predicting his reactions and managing his expectations. But I found I had a gift for analysis, for taking disparate pieces of information and assembling them into actionable intelligence. My instructors took notice, recommended me for additional training, and before long I was being fast-tracked into positions usually reserved for officers with more years of experience. The military became my home in a way my father's house had never been, offering me structure without suffocation, discipline without degradation, respect based on merit rather than birthright or gender. I rose through the ranks steadily, earning commendations for my work in Iraq during my first deployment, where my language skills and cultural understanding proved invaluable in gathering intelligence from local sources. My commanding officers learned they could rely on me for accurate assessments, for creative solutions to complex problems, for the kind of dedication that came from someone who had everything to prove and nothing to lose. Meanwhile, back home, my family continued their performance of perfect American success, my absence edited out of the narrative like a scene that didn't fit the director's vision. Katya grew into exactly what my father wanted: beautiful and compliant, studying art history at Columbia, and dating boys from good families with good prospects. Mikhail took his place in my father's real estate empire, learning to be just as ruthless, just as image-obsessed, just as certain that the world owed him deference simply for existing. My mother grew thinner, quieter, more translucent, as if she was slowly disappearing, fading into the expensive wallpaper of the house my father had bought in Westchester County, a monument to his success that felt more like a mausoleum. I kept tabs on them through social media and occasional calls with my mother, always when my father was at work, always brief and carefully neutral. She would tell me about Katya's achievements, Mikhail's engagement to a senator's daughter, my father's latest business triumph, and I would tell her sanitized versions of my life, mentioning promotions but not deployments, commendations but not combat, success but not sacrifice. It was a delicate dance, maintaining just enough connection to avoid complete estrangement while protecting myself from being drawn back into their toxic orbit. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for Katya's engagement to Harrison Blackwood III, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, and exactly the kind of son-in-law my father had been cultivating since Katya was old enough to date. The wedding was to be the social event of the season, a merger of families that would cement the Rostovas' place in American high society. The culmination of everything my father had worked for since arriving on these shores, with nothing but ambition and a willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. The invitation arrived at my base in Germany on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered along with classified briefings and routine correspondence, looking almost absurdly out of place among the military documentation. The envelope was heavy, expensive, the kind of paper that whispered money with every fiber, addressed in calligraphy that must have cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills. Inside, the invitation itself was a masterpiece of understated elegance, all cream and gold, with not a single acknowledgement of my military rank or current position. As if the past 14 years of my life had been nothing more than an extended gap year, a phase I was going through before returning to take my proper place in the family hierarchy. But there was something else in the envelope, a handwritten note from my mother on her personal stationery, the pale blue paper she'd used for correspondence since I was a child. "Please come, my Eva," she'd written in her careful script. "I need you to be there. There are things you should know, things I cannot write. Please." It was the most she had ever asked of me directly, the closest she had come to admitting that everything was not perfect in the Rostova family paradise, and I knew I couldn't ignore it, couldn't abandon her to face whatever was coming alone. I submitted my leave request that afternoon, citing family obligations, and my commanding officer, Colonel Jennifer Hayes, approved it without question. She knew something of my family situation, having been my mentor for the past 5 years, and she understood the complicated dynamics that came with being a woman who had chosen service over social expectations. "Take care of what you need to take care of, Captain," she said, her tone suggesting she knew this was about more than just attending a wedding. "And remember, you've earned the right to stand tall in any room, no matter who else is in it." The 6 months between receiving the invitation and the wedding itself were spent in preparation, though not the kind my family would have expected. While they were undoubtedly focused on flowers and catering, guest lists and seating charts, I was building something else entirely, a network of support and validation that would serve as both shield and sword when the time came. I reached out to General Robert Miller, my former commanding officer who had become something of a father figure. The kind of father I should have had, one who valued strength over submission and achievement over appearance. I explained the situation, the likelihood that my father would use the wedding as an opportunity to publicly diminish my service, to try to force me back into the box I had escaped from all those years ago. "Captain Rostova," General Miller said during one of our secure calls, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of military service. "You've served your country with distinction in 3 combat zones. You've provided intelligence that has saved countless lives, and you've earned the respect of every officer you've worked with. Your father's opinion of your service is irrelevant to its value, but I understand the need to make that value visible to those who refuse to see it. Consider me at your disposal." I also connected with James Patterson, a former JAG officer who had transitioned to private practice specializing in military law and family dynamics. We had worked together on a classified case involving intelligence leaks, and he had been impressed by my thoroughness and attention to detail. Over several encrypted conversations, I laid out the history of my family, the pattern of control and manipulation, the likelihood that my father would attempt to use the wedding to reassert his dominance over me. James listened carefully, asking pointed questions, building an understanding of the situation that went beyond legal implications to the psychological warfare my father had been waging for decades. "The thing about men like your father," James said during one particularly revealing conversation, "is that they never expect their victims to fight back with their own weapons. He's built his entire identity around being the most powerful person in any room, the one who controls the narrative. The key to defeating him isn't to attack that identity directly, but to reveal it as the illusion it's always been. When the time comes, and you'll know when it comes, all you have to do is give me the signal, and we'll show everyone who really has power." I also reached out to Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating military personnel and who had helped me work through some of my own family trauma during particularly difficult deployments. She helped me prepare mentally for what was coming, for the emotional manipulation I would likely face, for the guilt and obligation my family would try to weaponize against me. "Remember," she said during our final session before I flew home, "you're not responsible for your father's emotions or reactions. You're not obligated to make yourself smaller to make him feel bigger. You've built a life of purpose and meaning, and no one, not even family, has the right to diminish that." The flight from Germany to New York felt like traveling backwards through time, each mile bringing me closer to a past I'd worked so hard to escape. I wore my dress uniform for the flight, partly for practical reasons, but mostly as armor, a reminder to myself of who I had become, of what I had achieved, of the respect I'd earned in a world that valued actions over words. The other passengers noticed, some thanking me for my service, others simply nodding respectfully, and I tried to absorb their recognition, to store it up like a battery, charging for the battle ahead. My mother met me at the airport alone, my father apparently too busy with wedding preparations to acknowledge my return. She looked older, more fragile, the years of managing my father's moods having taken their toll in ways that makeup couldn't quite hide. When she saw me in uniform, her eyes filled with tears, and she held me tighter than she had since I was a child, whispering in Russian, "You look like who you were meant to be." In the car, she tried to prepare me for what was coming, her words careful, coded, the habit of protecting my father even from his own children too ingrained to break. "Your father has been under a lot of stress," she said, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "The wedding is very important to him, to all of us. Harrison's family has certain expectations, and your father wants everything to be perfect." What she meant, what she couldn't quite say, was that my presence was a complication, a reminder that not all Rostova women had followed the prescribed path, that one had escaped and thrived outside his control. "He's planned a speech," she added, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "About family, about choices, about proper roles." The family home in Westchester was exactly as I had imagined it would be, a massive colonial that screamed new money trying to look like old money, all white columns and manicured lawns and the kind of perfection that felt sterile rather than welcoming. My father had bought it 5 years ago, according to my mother, after closing a particularly lucrative deal, and every inch of it was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors that Dmitry Rostova had made it in America, had achieved the dream that had driven him from Moscow all those years ago. He was in his study when we arrived, and he made me wait 20 minutes before acknowledging my presence, a power play so transparent it was almost amusing. When he finally called me in, he was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by photographs of himself with various important people, none of which included me. He looked older but not diminished. His hair silver now but still thick. His suit impeccable. His bearing that of a man who had never doubted his own importance. "Eva," he said, not standing, not offering any greeting beyond my name, which he pronounced like it was something distasteful. "I see you've come in costume." His eyes flicked over my uniform, dismissively, as if it were a Halloween outfit rather than the representation of 14 years of service. "I trust you brought appropriate clothing for the wedding. Harrison's family has certain standards, and I won't have you embarrassing us with your military play acting." The old Eva, the child who had lived in fear of his disapproval, might have flinched at those words, might have apologized, might have promised to be whoever he wanted her to be. But Captain Rostova had faced down insurgents and terrorists, had made decisions that affected national security, had earned the respect of generals and the trust of soldiers, and she wasn't about to be diminished by a man who measured success in square footage and social connections. "I brought appropriate attire, Father," I said, my voice steady, professional, giving nothing away. I wouldn't want to disappoint Katya on her special day. The week leading up to the wedding was a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance and observation. I helped with preparations when asked, attended the rehearsal dinner in a tasteful cocktail dress that gave no hint of my military career, smiled politely at Harrison's family, who looked at me with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for exotic animals in a zoo. "So you're the soldier sister," Harrison's mother said at one point, her tone suggesting she found the idea both quaint and slightly disturbing. How unusual. Your father must be so proud. My father, standing nearby, laughed in that way that wasn't really a laugh, more like a verbal sneer dressed up as humor. Eva has always been determined to be different, he said, his arm around Katya possessively, as if to emphasize which daughter had made the right choices. Some children follow the path their parents prepare for them, and others insist on learning things the hard way. But we're hopeful she'll come to her senses eventually. There's still time for her to have a real life, a family, something meaningful. Katya, beautiful in her designer dress, her hair perfect, her smile practiced, said nothing. But I caught something in her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, or might have been pity, or might have been something else entirely. She had become exactly what our father wanted, the perfect daughter, the trophy he could display. But at what cost? Looking at her, I saw myself as I might have been if I had stayed, if I had submitted, if I had agreed to be a prize rather than a person. And I felt both grateful for my escape and guilty for leaving her behind. Mikhail, now a carbon copy of our father in everything but age, was worse. His contempt for my choices obvious in every interaction. Still playing G.I. Jane? He asked one evening when we were briefly alone. You know no one actually respects that, right? They're just being polite. Everyone knows women in the military are just trying to prove something, compensating for not being able to compete in the real world. The fact that he said this while living off our father's money, having never earned anything on his own merit, was an irony that seemed completely lost on him. Through it all, I maintained my composure, my military bearing serving me well in navigating the minefield of family dynamics. I helped my mother with flower arrangements, listening to her careful small talk that avoided anything real, anything that might acknowledge the gulf between who we were and who we pretended to be. I attended the bachelor party dinner, sitting through Harrison's friends' crude jokes about military women, their assumptions about why I had really joined, their barely concealed belief that I must be either a lesbian or desperate for male attention to choose such a path. But I was also watching, gathering intelligence the way I'd been trained to do, noticing things others might miss. The way my mother flinched when my father raised his voice. The pills Katya took when she thought no one was looking, anxiety medication based on the label I glimpsed. The bruises on my mother's wrists that she kept covered with expensive bracelets. The way Harrison spoke to Katya, not cruelly but dismissively, like she was an accessory rather than a person. And the way she accepted it as normal, as expected, as the price of the life she had been raised to want. I also noticed other things that would prove useful later. The photographer my father had hired who had a military background, evident from his bearing and the small unit tattoo visible on his wrist. The wedding planner who mentioned her son was serving in Afghanistan, the pride evident in her voice despite her professional demeanor. The bartender at the rehearsal dinner who wore a subtle pin indicating he was a veteran, who nodded at me with recognition when he saw me notice it. These people, scattered throughout the wedding preparation, were potential allies, people who understood service and sacrifice in ways my family never would. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep, my mind running through possibilities, contingencies, responses to whatever my father had planned. I knew he would try to humiliate me publicly, to use the wedding toast as an opportunity to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone that despite my military service, I was still just his wayward daughter who needed to be brought back into line. It was his pattern, his way of maintaining control. And the fact that I had been gone for so long would only make him more determined to make an example of me. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went for a run through the quiet streets of Westchester, the suburban perfection almost surreal in the pre-dawn darkness. As I ran, I thought about all the places I had been since leaving this world behind. The bases in Iraq where the temperature reached 120 degrees, the mountains of Afghanistan where every breath was a struggle in the thin air, the secure facilities in Germany, where decisions were made that affected the lives of thousands. I thought about the soldiers I'd served with, the ones who had made it home and the ones who hadn't. The weight of their sacrifice making my family drama seem almost insignificant in comparison. But it wasn't insignificant, not really. because this was about more than just my father's ego or my family's dysfunction. This was about the right to define yourself, to choose your own path, to earn respect through action rather than inheritance. This was about every woman who had been told she was meant to be a prize rather than a person, every daughter who had been sacrificed on the altar of family reputation, every girl who had been taught that her dreams mattered less than her father's expectations. This was about breaking cycles, changing narratives, proving that strength came in many forms and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to play by someone else's rules. When I returned from my run, my mother was awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, looking small and lost in the massive space my father had insisted they needed. "Eva," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." She looked around nervously, as if my father might appear at any moment, even though I could hear his snoring from their bedroom upstairs. "Your father has invited some of his business associates to the wedding, important people he wants to impress. He's planning to use his toast to make a point about family values, about proper choices, about—" She trailed off, unable to finish, but I understood. "About me," I said, sitting down across from her, still in my running clothes, sweat cooling on my skin. "He's going to use Katya's wedding to publicly shame me for my choices, to try to humiliate me into coming back, into being what he wants me to be." My mother nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. The weight of her complicity in this family dynamic, finally too much to bear in the early morning honesty. "I'm so sorry, Eva," she whispered. "I should have been stronger, should have protected you better, should have stood up to him. But I was afraid, am afraid, have always been afraid." And now Katya is marrying a man just like him, and the cycle continues, and I don't know how to stop it. Don't know how to save her like I couldn't save you. The admission hung between us, years of unspoken truth finally given voice, and I reached across the table to take her hands, feeling how thin they had become, how fragile. "You did save me, Mama," I said, using the childhood name I hadn't spoken in years. "You gave me permission to leave, to be something more than what he wanted. And today, at the wedding, I'm going to show everyone that leaving was the best decision I ever made. Trust me, please. For once, just trust me." She squeezed my hands, her grip stronger than I expected, and nodded, something like hope flickering in her eyes for the first time in years. The morning of the wedding dawned perfect, the kind of crisp September day that wedding planners dream of. All blue skies and gentle breezes and the leaves just beginning to turn gold at the edges. The venue was a historic mansion on Long Island, every inch of it screaming old money respectability, the kind of place where generations of privileged families had celebrated their carefully orchestrated unions. My father had spared no expense, determining that this wedding would be his masterpiece, the event that would cement his place in the social hierarchy he had spent decades climbing. I dressed carefully in the bridesmaid dress Katya had chosen, an elegant burgundy number that was actually quite tasteful, though I suspected that had more to do with Harrison's mother's influence than my sister's preferences. As I did my makeup, I thought about all the times I had prepared for missions, the careful attention to detail, the focus on the objective, the mental preparation for whatever might come. This was just another mission, I told myself, though perhaps the most personal one I had ever undertaken. The ceremony itself was beautiful in that sterile way that expensive weddings often are. Every detail perfect, but somehow lacking warmth, lacking the genuine joy that should accompany the union of two people in love. Katya looked stunning, of course, every inch the bride my father had raised her to be, but I could see the strain around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Harrison looked satisfied, like a man who had just closed a particularly good business deal. And I suppose in a way he had. Acquiring the perfect wife to complete his perfect life. My father walked Katya down the aisle with the bearing of a king granting a favor. His pride so evident it was almost painful to watch. This was his moment of triumph, the culmination of everything he had worked for, his daughter marrying into the kind of family he had always aspired to join. He caught my eye as he passed, and his expression was clear. "See what you could have had if you hadn't been so stubborn, so determined to embarrass me with your ridiculous military games." The reception was held in a ballroom that could have hosted a state dinner, all crystal chandeliers and gold accents and flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The guests were a who's who of New York society, the kind of people who measured worth in stock portfolios and social connections, who would smile to your face while calculating your value in their mental ledgers. I was seated at the family table, of course, though pointedly at the far end, as far from the center of attention as possible, while still maintaining the appearance of family unity. The dinner was exquisite, 7 courses of perfectly prepared food that I barely tasted. My attention focused on my father as he worked the room, accepting congratulations, making connections, playing the role of successful patriarch to perfection. I could see him building up to his toast, the anticipation evident in the way he kept checking his watch, adjusting his tie, practicing his expression of paternal pride. He had something planned, something designed to put me in my place once and for all, and he could barely contain his excitement at the prospect. Finally, as dessert was being served, he stood, tapping his champagne flute with a silver spoon, the crystal ringing out across the ballroom like a bell tolling. The room fell silent, hundreds of faces turning toward him expectantly. And he stood there for a moment, savoring the attention, the control, the power of having everyone waiting on his words. This was his element, his stage, and he was about to give the performance of his lifetime. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his accent thick with emotion, real or performed, I couldn't tell. "Today we celebrate not just the union of 2 wonderful young people, but the continuation of a tradition, the passing of values from one generation to the next, the triumph of family over all the forces that would seek to tear it apart." He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me with laser focus. "As many of you know, I came to this country with nothing but ambition and a dream of building something lasting, something meaningful, something that would honor the sacrifices of those who came before and provide for those who would come after. And today, seeing my beautiful Katya marry Harrison, seeing her embrace the role she was born to play, the role of wife and soon, God willing, mother, I know that dream has been realized." The applause was polite but enthusiastic, the crowd responding to the immigrant success story they all loved to hear, the confirmation that America was still the land of opportunity. "Family," he continued, his voice growing stronger, more pointed, "is about understanding your place, your purpose, your responsibility to something greater than yourself. It's about recognizing that some paths lead to fulfillment and others—" He paused dramatically, his eyes fixed on me. "Others lead only to loneliness and regret. Some of us understand this instinctively, like my Katya, like my son Mikhail, who has taken his place in the family business with pride and competence. And some—" Another pause, another pointed look. "Some have to learn the hard way that playing soldier, pretending to be something you're not, pursuing masculine fantasies of glory and adventure, these things cannot replace the fundamental truth of what a woman is meant to be." The room had grown uncomfortable now, the tension palpable as people began to realize this wasn't just a wedding toast but a public shaming. A father using his daughter's wedding to humiliate another daughter. I could feel eyes on me, some sympathetic, some curious, some almost gleeful at the drama unfolding. But I remained still, my military training serving me well, my expression neutral, giving nothing away even as my father continued his carefully crafted attack. "My eldest daughter, Eva," he said, and the way he said my name was like a curse. "Chose to abandon her family, to reject everything we offered her, to pursue a career in the military of all things, as if wearing a uniform could change what she fundamentally is. As if playing with guns and pretending to be tough could somehow make her equal to men who were born for such things. And where has it led her? Here she sits, 32 years old, unmarried, childless, having wasted the best years of her life on a fantasy, a delusion that she could be something other than what nature intended." My mother had gone pale beside me, her hands trembling as she reached for her water glass. Katya was staring at her plate, unable or unwilling to watch what was happening. Mikhail was smirking, enjoying every moment of my humiliation, and Harrison's family was watching with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for car accidents, unable to look away from the spectacular cruelty being displayed. "But there is still hope," my father continued, warming to his theme now, his voice taking on the tone of a preacher delivering a sermon. Eva is still young enough to course correct, to find a good man who can overlook her past mistakes, to have children before it's too late, to return to the family that loves her despite her rebellious phase. I'm sure there's someone here tonight, perhaps one of Harrison's friends, who might be willing to take on such a project, to help her remember what it means to be a woman, to trade her combat boots for dancing shoes, her rifle for a rolling pin, her delusions of equality for the reality of her proper place. The laughter that followed was uncomfortable, forced, the kind of laughter that comes when people don't know how else to respond to something so breathtakingly inappropriate. But my father took it as encouragement, raising his glass high, preparing for his final blow, the words that would complete my humiliation and re-establish his dominance once and for all. "So I propose a toast," he said, his voice ringing with triumph, "to family, to tradition, to knowing one's place, and to the hope that even the most wayward daughters can eventually find their way home to become the women they were always meant to be. To Katya, who has made us proud, and to Eva, who still has time to do the same if she can just abandon this military nonsense and remember what really matters." The silence that followed was deafening, the entire room waiting to see how I would respond, if I would respond, if I would crumble under the weight of such public humiliation or fight back against the man who had just attempted to destroy me in front of hundreds of witnesses. My father stood there, glass raised, smile triumphant, absolutely certain that he had won, that he had finally put me in my place, that the combination of public shame and family pressure would break me as it had broken so many before me. And that's when it happened. That's when 3 words changed everything, when years of careful planning came to fruition, when the hunter became the hunted and the victor became the vanquished. From the main entrance to the ballroom, a voice rang out with military precision, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, carrying the authority of the United States Army and the weight of a nation's respect. "Attention on deck!" The words echoed through the ballroom with the force of a command that could not be ignored, that demanded immediate response from anyone who had ever served, that carried more authority than any corporate title or social position ever could. Every veteran in the room, and there were more than my father had realized, immediately straightened, their bodies responding to the command before their minds could even process what was happening. The photographer, the bartender, even one of Harrison's groomsmen who I hadn't realized had served, all snapped to attention, their response automatic and absolute. Through the main entrance walked 2 figures in full-dress uniform, their presence immediately commanding the room in a way my father never could despite all his posturing and power plays. The first was Colonel Jennifer Hayes, my current commanding officer, her uniform immaculate, her bearing that of someone who had led soldiers in combat and earned their respect through competence rather than inheritance. The second was General Robert Miller, 3 stars gleaming on his shoulders, his presence alone enough to make even the most privileged civilians in the room understand that genuine power had just entered their midst. They walked with purpose, their footsteps echoing in the stunned silence, bypassing my father entirely as if he were nothing more than furniture, an obstacle to be navigated around rather than acknowledged. The dismissal was so complete, so devastating, that I saw him physically stagger, his champagne glass trembling in his hand, the golden liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no words coming out. His carefully prepared script, useless in the face of something he had never anticipated. General Miller stopped directly in front of me, and I stood, my training taking over, my body snapping to attention with the same precision I had learned all those years ago in basic training. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, ensuring that everyone would hear what came next. "I apologize for interrupting your family celebration, but a matter of national importance has arisen that requires immediate attention." "Sir," I responded, my voice clear and professional, giving nothing away even as my heart raced with anticipation. This was the moment we had planned, the strategic response to my father's predictable cruelty, but even knowing it was coming didn't diminish the impact of seeing it unfold. "Before we proceed with the urgent matter," General Miller continued, turning slightly to address the room while still maintaining military protocol. I feel it's important to correct some misconceptions that were just expressed about your service." He paused, his eyes finding my father, who had gone from red to white, his face a canvas of shifting emotions, as he began to understand that his moment of triumph was about to become his greatest humiliation. Captain Eva Rostova is one of the finest intelligence officers the United States Army has ever produced. She has served with distinction in 3 combat zones, providing actionable intelligence that has saved countless American and Allied lives. She speaks 5 languages fluently, has been commended for valor under fire on 2 separate occasions, and just last month, her analysis prevented what would have been the largest terrorist attack on European soil since the London bombings. The room was absolutely silent now, every eye fixed on General Miller as he systematically destroyed every assumption my father had tried to create about my service. Furthermore, Colonel Hayes added, stepping forward, "Captain Rostova has been selected for promotion to Major, one of the youngest officers to achieve this rank in the Intelligence Corps. She has also been chosen to lead a new joint task force focusing on Eastern European security threats, a position that requires not just military expertise, but diplomatic skills and strategic thinking of the highest order." The Secretary of Defense personally requested her for this role, stating that there is no one better qualified in the entire United States military. I heard gasps from around the room, saw phones being discreetly pulled out to Google my name, saw the expression on Harrison's mother's face shift from disdain to something approaching awe. But I kept my eyes forward, maintaining military bearing even as I felt the ground shifting beneath my father's feet, his entire worldview crumbling as the truth of my service was laid bare for all to see. "But that's not why we're here," General Miller said, his tone shifting to something more formal, more official. "Captain Rostova, it is my honor to inform you that the President of the United States has awarded you the Defense Superior Service Medal for your exceptional performance in a classified operation that directly contributed to the safety and security of our nation. The ceremony will be held at the Pentagon next week, with the Secretary of Defense presiding." He pulled out a folder, official and imposing, the seal of the Department of Defense visible on its cover. "Additionally, your presence is required immediately for a briefing on a developing situation in Eastern Europe. A car is waiting outside to take you to the airport, where a military aircraft is standing by. I understand this is your sister's wedding, and I apologize for the timing, but national security takes precedence over personal celebrations." The implication was clear to everyone in the room. I was important enough, valuable enough, essential enough that the United States military would pull me from my sister's wedding because they needed me. Not wanted me, needed me. The contrast with my father's portrayal of my service as playing soldier could not have been more stark, more devastating to his narrative, more complete in its destruction of everything he had just said. I turned to Katya, who was staring at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before. Genuine admiration, maybe even envy. "I'm so sorry, Katya," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I wanted to be here for your whole wedding, but duty calls. I hope you understand." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, though whether they were tears of joy for her wedding or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. Then I turned to my father, who was still standing there with his champagne glass raised in a toast that no one had drunk to, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. "Father," I said, my voice carrying the same authority I used when briefing generals, "thank you for the toast. You're right that family is about understanding your place and purpose. I've found mine serving something greater than personal ambition or social climbing. I found it in protecting people who can't protect themselves, in earning respect through action rather than inheritance, in proving that women can be warriors just as effectively as they can be wives, and that neither role is superior to the other, simply different choices for different people." The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Hundreds of New York's elite witnessing the complete reversal of power between father and daughter. The moment when years of dismissal and denigration were answered not with anger or tears, but with undeniable proof of achievement that transcended anything my father had ever accomplished. "And you're also right that some people have to learn things the hard way," I continued, my voice steady, controlled, professional. I learned the hard way that seeking approval from someone incapable of giving it is a waste of time. I learned that real strength isn't about controlling others, but about controlling yourself. I learned that respect earned is worth infinitely more than respect demanded. And I learned that sometimes the best thing a daughter can do for her family is to show them what's possible when you refuse to accept the limitations others try to place on you. General Miller cleared his throat, a subtle reminder that we had a schedule to keep, a performance to complete. Captain, we need to move. The situation is time-sensitive. I nodded, then did something that wasn't part of the plan but felt necessary in the moment. I walked over to my mother, who was crying openly now, and kissed her cheek, whispering in Russian, "You're stronger than you know, Mama. It's never too late to find your own voice." Then I walked back to where General Miller and Colonel Hayes were waiting, falling into step between them, my bridesmaid dress incongruous with their uniforms, but somehow making the point even more strongly. Here was a woman who could be both, who could wear a dress to support her sister and a uniform to serve her country, who didn't have to choose between femininity and strength, because they were not mutually exclusive, despite what my father had always believed. As we reached the door, General Miller turned back one more time, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of command. "Mr. Rostova, you should be proud of your daughter. She represents the best of what America can produce: intelligence, courage, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to something greater than herself. The fact that you can't see that says nothing about her value and everything about your limitations." And then we were gone, walking out of that ballroom and leaving behind a chaos of conversation, 100 simultaneous discussions about what they had just witnessed, about the complete destruction of Dmitry Rostova's reputation, not through scandal or failure, but through the simple revelation that his greatest shame was actually his greatest achievement, if only he had been capable of seeing it. The car was indeed waiting outside, a black SUV with government plates, and as soon as we were inside and pulling away from the venue, General Miller's stern expression cracked into a smile. "Outstanding performance, Captain. Your father's face when we walked in. I haven't seen someone look that shocked since we caught Saddam Hussein hiding in that spider hole." "Thank you for doing this, sir," I said, finally allowing myself to relax, to feel the weight of what had just happened. I know it was an unusual request, using military resources for what was essentially a personal matter. Personal matter? Colonel Hayes laughed, shaking her head. "Captain, what we just did in there was strike a blow for every woman who has ever been told she couldn't serve, couldn't lead, couldn't be both strong and feminine. Your father just became the poster child for toxic masculinity being taken down by the very daughter he tried to diminish. By tomorrow, that video is going to be everywhere." "Video?" I asked, though I wasn't really surprised. These things never stayed private in the age of smartphones and social media. "At least a dozen people were recording," General Miller confirmed. "I guarantee someone in that room is already uploading it to social media with a title like, 'Army General Destroys Sexist Father at Wedding,' or something equally click-worthy. Your father wanted an audience for your humiliation, and he got one, just not the way he expected." We drove to an actual military facility, maintaining the illusion in case anyone was watching, and I changed from my bridesmaid dress into my regular uniform, feeling more like myself with each piece of military attire I put on. There was no urgent mission, of course, that had been part of the performance, but there was a debriefing of sorts, a conversation about what had just happened and what would happen next. "Your father is going to try to retaliate," James Patterson said over secure video link, having watched the whole thing through a live stream one of his contacts had set up. "Men like him don't accept defeat easily, especially such a public one. He'll try to spin this, to make himself the victim, to claim you disrespected your family and ruined your sister's wedding." "Let him try," I said, feeling a calm I hadn't experienced in years, the peace that comes from finally standing up to a bully and winning. The video speaks for itself. He used his daughter's wedding toast to publicly humiliate me for my military service, and the military responded by publicly validating that service. Any attempt to spin that is going to make him look even worse. And I was right. Within hours, the video was viral. shared thousands of times with comments ranging from outrage at my father's behavior to admiration for the military's response. Veterans organizations picked it up. Women's groups shared it, and by the next morning, my father was trending on social media as the face of toxic parenting, the cautionary tale of what happens when you value control over love, image over substance, tradition over growth. The calls started coming almost immediately, from reporters wanting statements, from talk shows wanting interviews, from publishers wanting book deals. I declined them all, having no interest in profiting from my family's dysfunction or extending my father's humiliation beyond what had already occurred. The point had been made, the message delivered, and anything more would have been cruelty rather than justice. My mother called the next day, her voice stronger than I had heard it in years. "Your father has locked himself in his study," she said, and there was something almost like satisfaction in her tone. "He won't come out, won't eat, won't talk to anyone." Harrison's family is furious, saying he ruined the wedding with his inappropriate toast. Several of his business associates have called to distance themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone who would treat his daughter that way, especially a daughter who has served her country with such distinction. "I'm sorry about Katya's wedding," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I hadn't wanted to ruin my sister's day, had only wanted to defend myself against my father's attack. "Don't be," my mother said firmly. "Katya called me this morning. She said watching you stand up to your father, seeing what you've actually accomplished, it made her realize she doesn't have to accept Harrison's treatment, doesn't have to become another version of me. She's postponing the honeymoon to think about what she really wants. You didn't ruin her wedding, Eva. You might have saved her life." The aftermath rippled out in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mikhail, suddenly faced with the reality that his sister was not a failure but a highly decorated military officer with connections and influence he could never match, began reconsidering his own choices, his blind following of our father's path. Some of my father's employees, inspired by the video, began standing up to his bullying management style, and several key people quit to find healthier work environments. But perhaps the most significant change was in my mother. For the first time in my memory, she stood up to my father, not dramatically or violently, but firmly and finally. She moved into the guest room, consulted with a divorce attorney, and began the process of reclaiming her life at 63 years old. "You showed me it's never too late to find your courage," she told me during one of our phone calls. "If you could stand up to him in front of all those people, I can stand up to him in my own home." My father, for his part, never recovered from the humiliation. His business began to struggle as his reputation crumbled, his toxic behavior finally catching up with him in an era that no longer tolerated such blatant misogyny. He tried to reach out to me once, 6 months after the wedding, leaving a voicemail that was half apology, half accusation, wholly inadequate. I didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ashes. I returned to my post in Germany, to the work that gave my life meaning, to the service that had saved me from becoming another casualty of my father's toxic worldview. But something had changed, something fundamental and profound. I no longer carried the weight of his disapproval, the burden of trying to prove myself to someone incapable of seeing my worth. I was free in a way I had never been before, not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. The promotion to major came through as promised, and with it, new responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to serve. I threw myself into the work with renewed energy, knowing that I was doing it for myself, for my country, for the soldiers under my command, but not for anyone's approval or validation. The respect I had earned was mine, undeniable and unshakable, and no one, not even family, could take that away from me. A year after the wedding, I received an unexpected package at my base in Germany. Inside was a photo from the wedding, taken moments before General Miller and Colonel Hayes had arrived. In it, my father stood with his champagne glass raised, his face twisted with cruel satisfaction, absolutely certain of his power and control. Someone, probably my mother, had written on the back, "The moment before everything changed. Thank you for showing us all what real strength looks like. Love, your proud family, the ones who matter." I kept that photo on my desk, not as a trophy or a reminder of victory, but as a testament to the power of standing up for yourself, of refusing to accept others' limitations as your own, of choosing service over submission. Every time a young female soldier came to me struggling with family disapproval or societal pressure, I would tell them this story, show them that photo, and remind them that the only approval that matters is the one you give yourself through actions that align with your values. The military had given me more than a career. It had given me an identity that couldn't be diminished by anyone's opinion, a purpose that transcended family dysfunction, and a strength that came not from breaking others down, but from building something meaningful. My father had been wrong about so many things, but perhaps his greatest error was in believing that power came from control rather than from service, that respect could be demanded rather than earned, that tradition was more important than growth. Looking back now, I realize that the confrontation at the wedding wasn't really about revenge or even justice. It was about truth, the simple, powerful act of refusing to let someone else's narrative define you, of standing up and saying, "This is who I really am," and my father had tried to use public humiliation as a weapon. But he had failed to understand that shame only works on those who accept it, and I had long ago stopped accepting his version of who I should be. The last time I heard about my father was through Katya, who had indeed postponed her honeymoon and eventually called off the wedding entirely, choosing to pursue her own path rather than the one that had been laid out for her. She told me he had become something of a cautionary tale in their social circles, the man who had tried to shame his war hero daughter and had been deservedly humiliated for it. He lived alone now in that massive house, surrounded by photographs of the success he had achieved and the family he had lost, a king in an empty kingdom, ruling over nothing but his own bitter regret. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no joy in his isolation. If anything, I felt a kind of pity for a man so trapped by his own toxic beliefs that he had pushed away everyone who might have loved him, so obsessed with control that he had lost everything worth controlling. But that pity didn't extend to forgiveness or reconciliation. Some people are lessons in what not to become, cautionary tales that teach through negative example, and my father had become exactly that. The story could end there, with the toxic patriarch defeated and the daughter victorious. But life is never that simple, never that clean. The real ending, the true resolution, came 3 years later when I was asked to speak at a conference on women in the military. I stood before an audience of young female cadets, all of them facing their own battles with family, expectations, and societal pressure. And I told them this story, not as a tale of revenge, but as a testimony to the power of perseverance. Your worth is not determined by anyone's opinion of you, I told them, looking at their young faces and seeing myself at 18, desperate to escape but afraid to leave. Not your father's, not society's, not even the military's. Your worth is determined by your actions, by your choices, by your willingness to serve something greater than yourself while still maintaining your own identity. Some of you will face families who don't understand your choice, who will try to diminish your service, who will attempt to make you feel less than for choosing strength over submission. When that happens, remember that their limitations are not your limitations. Their fears are not your fears. Their narrow definitions of what a woman should be have no bearing on what you can become. After the speech, a young cadet approached me, tears in her eyes, and told me her own story of a father who had disowned her for joining the military, who had called her a disgrace to the family, who had used every manipulation tactic possible to try to force her to quit. "What do I do?" she asked, the question I had asked myself so many times during those early years. "You serve with honor," I told her. "You excel in your training, you become the best officer you can be, and you let your achievements speak louder than his disapproval. And if the day comes when he tries to publicly shame you for your choices, you stand tall in the knowledge that you've earned something he never could. Respect based on merit rather than intimidation. The uniform you wear represents something greater than any family tradition, and the oath you took supersedes any obligation to accept toxic treatment, even from family." She nodded, straightening her shoulders, and I saw in her the same determination that had carried me through basic training, through combat deployments, through that confrontation at my sister's wedding. Another young woman refusing to be limited by someone else's narrow vision of what she should be. Another daughter choosing service over submission. Another link in the chain of women who had fought for the right to serve and who continued to prove every day that strength has no gender. As I flew back to my post after the conference, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. From that scared 12-year-old at the kitchen table, declaring her intention to join the military, to the major, giving speeches about female empowerment through service. It hadn't been easy, had in fact been one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Harder in some ways than combat because the enemy was internal, familial, intimate in ways that made every victory feel like a betrayal and every defeat feel like destiny. But I had survived it, had thrived despite it, had turned my father's disapproval into fuel for excellence and his public attempt at humiliation into a moment of triumph that had inspired thousands of women who saw the video and recognized their own struggles in mine. The military had given me the tools to fight back, not with violence or cruelty, but with competence and dignity, with achievements that spoke louder than any words, with a community that valued me for who I was, rather than who someone else thought I should be. The sun was setting as we approached the base, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and I thought about my mother's words from that morning before the wedding. "You look like who you were meant to be." She had been right, though perhaps not in the way she had intended. I wasn't meant to be a soldier or a daughter or a sister or any single thing. I was meant to be myself, complex and contradictory, capable of wearing both a bridesmaid dress and combat boots, of being both tender and tough, of honoring my heritage while refusing to be limited by it. My father had tried to make me small, to fit me into a box labeled proper daughter, to clip my wings before I could discover I could fly. But he had failed to understand that some spirits can't be broken, only tempered, and that the pressure he applied had only made me stronger, more determined, more capable of standing up not just for myself, but for others facing the same battles. His toast at that wedding, meant to be my humiliation, had become my liberation. The moment when years of quiet endurance transformed into visible triumph, when the daughter he had dismissed proved herself to be more than he could ever imagine. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of this story. The truth that transcends family drama and military service and viral videos of confrontations at wedding receptions. It's that we all have the power to define ourselves, to reject the limitations others try to place on us, to choose our own paths even when those paths lead away from what's expected or comfortable or traditional. It's that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to be what someone else demands you to be. My name is Major Eva Rostova, and I am not my father's daughter in any way that matters. I am a soldier, an intelligence officer, a protector of those who cannot protect themselves. I am someone who chose service over submission, merit over inheritance, earned respect over demanded deference. I am proof that women can be warriors just as effectively as wives, that both choices are valid, and that no one, not even family, has the right to diminish either. The story that began with "attention on deck" at my sister's wedding reception doesn't really end, because stories like this never do. They ripple outward, inspiring some, threatening others, changing the narrative one person at a time. Every time a young woman stands up to family pressure to pursue her dreams, every time a father realizes his daughter's worth isn't determined by her adherence to his expectations, every time someone chooses authenticity over approval, the story continues, evolves, grows into something bigger than any individual experience. But if I had to choose an ending, a moment that encapsulates everything this journey has meant, it would be this. 2 years after the confrontation at the wedding, I received a letter from a father in Texas whose daughter had just enlisted in the Marines against his wishes. He had seen the video of what happened at my sister's wedding, had recognized himself in my father's cruel words and dismissive attitude, and had realized he was about to make the same mistake, was about to lose his daughter to his own rigid expectations. "Thank you," he wrote, "for showing me what I was about to become, and for giving me the chance to choose differently. I may not understand my daughter's choice, may not agree with it, but I will support it. Because I've seen what happens when fathers try to force their daughters into boxes they were never meant to fit in. She ships out to basic training next month, and I'll be there to see her off, proud of her courage even if I'm scared for her safety. Thank you for showing me that love means accepting who our children are, not who we want them to be. That letter sits framed on my desk next to the photo from the wedding, two bookends to a story about breaking free from toxic expectations and finding strength in service. Every day, they remind me that standing up for yourself isn't just about personal victory. It's about changing the narrative for those who come after, about making it a little easier for the next person to choose their own path, about proving that respect earned through action is worth infinitely more than approval granted through compliance. My father wanted me to trade my combat boots for dancing shoes, my rifle for a rolling pin, my independence for dependence. Instead, I kept my boots and learned to dance in them, kept my rifle and used it to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, kept my independence and used it to help others find theirs. The confrontation at the wedding wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I no longer needed anyone's permission to be exactly who I was meant to be. And that's the message I want to leave with anyone who has read this far, who has followed this journey from a frightened child at a kitchen table to a decorated officer standing tall in the face of public humiliation. Your story is yours to write. Others may try to edit it, to force it into familiar patterns, to insist that it follow traditional plot lines, but you hold the pen. You get to decide whether you're a supporting character in someone else's narrative or the protagonist of your own. Choose to be the protagonist. Choose to stand up when others expect you to sit down. Choose to speak when others demand your silence. Choose to serve something greater than yourself while never losing sight of who you are. Choose to turn attention on deck from a military command into a battle cry for everyone who has ever been told they're not enough, too much, or simply wrong for refusing to fit into someone else's definition of right. Because in the end, the only approval that matters is the one you see in the mirror each morning. The knowledge that you've lived according to your values rather than someone else's expectations. My father may never understand that, may go to his grave believing that I betrayed the family by choosing my own path, but that's his limitation, not mine. I know who I am, what I've accomplished, and what I stand for. And no toast at a wedding reception, no matter how cruel or public, can change that fundamental truth. The young girl who sat at that kitchen table dreaming of military service, who faced her father's slap and refused to surrender her dreams, who spent years planning her escape from a toxic household, she would be proud of who I've become. Not because I'm perfect or because I've achieved everything I set out to achieve, but because I didn't let anyone else's vision of my life override my own. I chose service, chose strength, chose to prove that women can be warriors without losing their humanity, can be tough without being cruel, can stand at attention while standing up for themselves. End.